Yes. Well, that's where my great interest in Cherokee history grew from, was my Cherokee ancestry. My great-great-great-grandmother was Cherokee. And I had grown up with the stories in our family that she managed to escape the Cherokee removal, which is also known as the Trail of Tears, of 1838 by marrying a white man. And that white man, my great-great-great-grandfather, while I was researching this book, I found his name on the Alabama militia rolls, which told me that he helped round up the Cherokees on the Trail of Tears. Well, the Cherokees were an autonomous, nationally recognized, legitimate tribe. The Supreme Court of the United States recognized their legitimacy. They had a lot of supporters in the Congress and the Senate who recognized their legitimate right to stay in the East. And it's just a very tragic story about how their legal rights were usurped by the whites for many reasons. The whites in the Southeast really wanted them to leave the Southeast, and the Trail of Tears, which talks about their actual removal from Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. The Trail of Tears is just very tragic because of the many deaths on the trail, all the illness, and the tragic circumstances. Excellent question. I grew up in Tennessee. I was a Jackson fancier for most of my life, and it's only been about the last 12 years that I've come to learn more about Jackson and what his role in the architecture for the plan of the removal of southeastern Indians. He was a primary architect for the removal of southeastern Indians, not just the Cherokees, but also the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Choctaws, and Chickasaws. And he was also a primary architect of the 1830 Indian Removal Act passed by Congress that called for the removal of all tribes east of the Mississippi, not just the southeastern Indians. And he, like a lot of our leaders in our history, definitely has two sides to him. I agree. Ross was only 1/8 Cherokee by blood, but he was fully accepted by the Cherokee tribe, and they made him his principal chief over the largest portion of the Cherokees in Georgia and Tennessee and part of North Carolina. There was another leader in North Carolina who was a little bit stronger than Ross in North Carolina. That was William Holland Thomas, who was 100% white. He was not Cherokee. But Ross was a victim in that he lost his lands. His lands were taken over just as all the other Cherokees were. And he lost his businesses as well. Well, the Cherokees were very astute from early on. Reading Cherokee history going back 200 or 300 years, you could tell by the 17th century the Cherokees were very politically astute in how to deal with the white men. And it's partly because they were so successful in picking leaders that could deal with the white men that they were one of the last tribes to be forced west of the Mississippi. And they were very good at picking leaders that could deal with white people. And of course, William Holland Thomas and John Ross were educated as whites and just knew how to deal with the white. Exactly. Well, I chose that passage because I think it's a very poignant editorial written by one of the most tragic men in Cherokee history, Elias Boudinot. As you mentioned, he is a journalist. He was the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix for a number of years, and that newspaper was written in both the Cherokee language, the syllabary invented by Sequoyah, as well as in English. And Boudinot's editorial just describes how the Cherokees must have felt back then, and as how Native Americans feel even up to today about all the gifts they gave the European immigrants, only to have all their lands and their possessions, their whole life, taken away from them. And Boudinot is such a tragic figure because he greatly opposed the intrusion by the white men in the beginning. And in the end, he had to concede that the white men were going to take their lands anyways, and he became involved in the Treaty of New Echota of 1835, which was the last nail in the Cherokees' coffin. And he was later killed by his own people because of his role in that. Well, fortunately, several of the doctors' reports have recently been, shall we say, kind of rediscovered. Some of the folks who are researching the trail, such as myself, have kind of rediscovered them. And Townsend's report was probably the most articulate and the most readable, and also one of the most tragic. He talks about the death and the dying and all the illness in the Cherokee removal camps, especially the children. They lost more children and elderly than they did adults. He describes whooping cough, cholera, dysentery, measles, you name it, they experienced it in the camps. Correct. A few of the detachments did travel by water. Yes. And the detachments that traveled by water, in the end, fared better. There weren't as many deaths during the actual journey. Now, we found letters that indicate that once these detachments that traveled by water reached their destination, that there were a number of deaths out there. But most of the detachments traveled this 800-mile circuitous route through Tennessee, and that trail came right through Murfreesboro and Nashville, and up through Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, and it's sort of a half-moon-shaped route. And that's the route most of the detachments followed, and most of them wound up having to camp on the banks of some very icy rivers because the rivers froze over and they couldn't cross the rivers, and had to camp during very snowy, very cold winter. Well, for 150 years, a lot of folks have believed that the primary cause of the Cherokee removal was the discovery of gold in North Georgia. And I don't think that's true. I think there were multiple reasons. That was just one, a lesser reason of many. But the Georgia militia and the Georgia state government was particularly harsh on the Cherokees, more so than the other state governments. And they had revoked a number of Cherokee rights, including the right for them to assemble, the right for the Cherokees to testify against white men. And you can't do a book about the Cherokee removal without talking about some of the harsh treatment that the Georgia state governments and the Georgia militia forced on the Cherokees. Exactly. Well, the Georgians considered the Christian missionaries, the Cherokees, as troublemakers because the missionaries supported the Cherokees' efforts to remain in their homelands. And Reverend Daniel Buttrick, and there was also Reverend Wooster and Reverend Butler. They were some of the missionaries that supported the Cherokees. And because they would not take an oath of allegiance, more or less, to the U.S. government, they were Americans, but they didn't feel like they should take this oath because it would be basically saying that the Cherokee Nation didn't exist and didn't have a right to exist. They were arrested. There were a series of arrests of missionaries, and several of them were jailed for many months. Yes. The Georgia militia, unfortunately, was just, well, in my opinion, was a group of thugs. And they were uneducated, very violent, and very cruel to both the Cherokees and the missionaries. At one point, they arrested John Ross and a visitor, Payne, and held them in chains. And they were just thugs. Well, as you mentioned, approximately 20 to 25% of the Cherokee population had already moved west as early as about 1819, and small groups moved out gradually over the next 19 years. And they had elected their own principal chief, who, by the way, was a close friend of General Sam Houston, another famous Tennessean. And then the treaty party, which included Elias Boudinot and Major Ridge and his son John Ridge, and another son, Buckwaddy, they had signed the Treaty of New Echota, and they were greatly despised and hated by the other Cherokees who didn't support the treaty. And they moved out in 1836 and 1837, and Major Ridge was the recognized leader of that group. And then when John Ross and what is called the National Party, which was the bulk of the Cherokees, moved out on the Trail of Tears in 1838 and 1839, there was a third very strong leader. And they made an attempt initially to reconcile the three groups, but it wasn't successful, and violence broke out. And some of Ross's followers murdered Major Ridge and Elias Boudinot. And at first, Ross was thought to be guilty and participating in this, but later testimony showed that he probably did not know about it in advance. Yes, it really was. And it was stirred up primarily by Jackson and some of his cronies, including Van Buren, and the Georgians, particularly the Southeast. They did have some sympathy in New England, and they had some senators in New England speak out in favor of Indian rights. The U.S. had been at war with Creek Indians for a number of years and had experienced a lot of very bloody violence. Exactly. But now the Cherokees helped Jackson in his fight against the Creeks. And the U.S. had also been at war with the Seminoles for a number of years, and that was fairly violent because the Seminoles were resisting removal and they wanted to stay in Florida. And John Ross, leader of the Cherokees, tried to act as an ambassador and help. And Ross thought, because of their contribution to the Creek and Seminole effort, that Jackson would treat them more kindly, which of course he didn't.